May 10th, 1996. Mount Everest. Scott Fisher reached the summit of the highest mountain on Earth at 3:40 in the afternoon. He had done the impossible. He would never make it back down. Not in the Khumbu icefall, where seracs the size of apartment buildings collapse without a sound. Not on the Lhotse face, where a single crampon mistake sends a climber thousands of feet into open air. Not at Camp 4, where the body begins dying faster than it can recover, and every breath delivers less oxygen than a person needs to think clearly. The climbers on Everest in the spring of 1996 were not beginners. They were guided expeditions led by some of the most experienced high-altitude professionals alive. Scott Fisher had stood on the summit of the world's highest peaks before. He had built a career on bringing clients up mountains and back down again safely, but he never made it back down. The part that bothers me with this story is that it was never just one mistake. Fisher didn't die because of a single bad decision. He died because of a chain, 5 specific, well-documented failures that climbers make not on the way up, but after they've already reached the top. This is why Everest kills people after they've already won. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what researchers found when they actually studied who dies on Everest and when. A major study published in the British Medical Journal looked at every death above 8,000 meters on Everest from 1921 to 2006. Among the 94 mountaineers who died after climbing above that threshold, 53 of them, more than half, did not die going up. They died descending from the summit. And newer research covering deaths from 1921 all the way through 2024 confirmed the pattern is still holding. 76.5% of climber deaths above base camp occurred on summit day. When you sit with that number, it changes the entire story of Everest. That is not a mountain killing people when they are fresh and focused and climbing in daylight. That is a mountain killing people when they are moving backward, depleted, using the last reserves of judgment they have left. Summit day on Everest typically involves moving continuously for 16 to 20 hours, much of that above 8,000 meters at an altitude where the air contains roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. The descent alone can take 8 to 10 hours of technical, unforgiving terrain, and climbers are doing that on a body that has already been pushed past its limit. The part I find almost impossible to process is this. Everest does not kill people at their worst moments on the way up. It kills them at what should be their best moment. After the summit photo, after the handshake, after the dream has already been confirmed real. That gap between expectation and reality is exactly what makes the descent so dangerous. So how does this actually happen? How does someone survive the Khumbu icefall, the Lhotse face, the death zone, the Hillary step, and then die going down? The answer starts with a question most climbers never think to ask. What is the body doing at the summit? The answer is not recovering. It is deteriorating. At 8,849 meters, the human brain is receiving less oxygen than it needs to function normally. The muscles are burning reserves they cannot replenish. And the longer a climber stays in the death zone, the worse each of those systems gets, not better. The CDC describes severe altitude illness as potentially including confusion, loss of coordination, and in the most serious cases, a life-threatening condition called high-altitude cerebral edema, where fluid builds in the brain. The treatment is urgent descent, oxygen, and medication. The cruel irony is that the illness itself, the confusion, the fatigue, the impaired coordination, makes the one required action harder to take. At sea level, tired means you slow down. At 8,000 meters, tired can mean you stop thinking clearly. You misjudge distances. You forget steps in a sequence you've practiced 100 times. You don't notice that your glove came loose. And the most terrifying part is that you may not know your judgment is gone. The deterioration can also happen faster than most people expect. Above 8,000 meters, even small reductions in oxygen supply can cause measurable changes in motor coordination and cognitive function within minutes. It is similar to what happens to a mildly impaired driver. The person often does not feel impaired, but their reaction time, their judgment, and their decision-making are already compromised in ways others would notice immediately. On Everest, there is often no one close enough to notice. That is the mechanism behind every descent death on Everest. Not a sudden catastrophe, a slow, invisible erosion of strength, oxygen, and decision-making, happening inside a body that still believes it is in control. And against that backdrop, climbers keep making 5 specific predictable mistakes. They have been made on Everest across different decades, different expeditions, different nationalities. They show up in the research, they show up in the accident reports, and they show up with painful consistency in the stories of the climbers who never came home. The first mistake is passing the turnaround time. Scott Fisher reached the Everest summit on May 10, 1996, at approximately 3:40 in the afternoon. The 2 o'clock turnaround rule, the agreed point at which any climber who has not yet summited must turn around, regardless of proximity to the top, exists for a precise reason. It accounts for the time required to descend safely, the rate at which oxygen reserves deplete, the window of reliable weather, and the speed at which darkness falls at altitude. Fisher was not unaware of it. He was an experienced guide who had built his career on decisions exactly like this one. But the summit was close. And on Everest, close is the most dangerous word in the dictionary. A summit at 3:40 in the afternoon is not a victory. It is a rescue problem that has not happened yet. The second mistake is spending oxygen. Like the summit is the finish line. This is not always about running out of oxygen. It is about underestimating how much the descent will cost when the body is already failing. Oxygen does not just keep a climber moving. It keeps them deciding. It maintains the thin margin of judgment that separates a controlled descent from a fatal one. When that margin shrinks, everything that follows becomes harder. Clipping into a fixed rope, recognizing a landmark, responding to a guide's instruction, noticing that a teammate has stopped moving. Physiological research on Everest non-survivors consistently identifies extreme fatigue, cognitive changes, and loss of coordination as factors in deaths above 8,000 meters. The oxygen math is not just arithmetic, it is the architecture of consciousness at altitude. The third mistake is sitting down too high. In 1979, Hannelore Schmatz became the first woman to die on Everest's upper slopes. After summiting, her group faced worsening conditions on the descent and bivouacked high on the southeast ridge without a tent, despite warnings. Ray Genet, the mountaineer she was climbing with, died overnight. During the descent the following day, Schmatz sat down at approximately 8,350 meters, asked for water, and could not go further. By the time she sat down, the chain had already formed. Summit fatigue, a high bivouac with no shelter, overnight exposure, and the brutal cold of the death zone working on a body that had already been at altitude for too long. At sea level, sitting down is recovery. Above 8,000 meters, sitting down can become surrender. The fourth mistake is ignoring the descent order. In May 2025, Indian climber Subrata Ghosh reached the summit of Everest. On the descent, he stopped below the Hillary Step and refused to continue down. A representative from his expedition operator, Snowy Horizon Treks, told Reuters directly, he refused to descend from below the Hillary Step. Ghosh died there. Sometimes the fatal mistake is not moving too slowly on the way up. It is hearing the words, "Go down now," and treating them like advice instead of an emergency instruction. The fifth mistake is believing the summit means the danger is over. In the 1996 disaster, multiple climbing teams summited after 2 p.m. Turnaround rules were not enforced. The mountain was crowded, weather was closing in, and oxygen supplies were thinning. Climbers who had spent years preparing for this day finally had what they came for. And in that moment, the summit photo, the exhausted handshake, the flag, many of them made the same invisible mistake. They felt the hard part was over. The summit gives a climber the most dangerous feeling on the mountain, relief, and relief at 8,849 meters can kill. May 10th, 1996, South Col, Mount Everest. The plan was as clear as any plan on Everest can be. Climbers from multiple expeditions would leave Camp 4 in the early hours of the morning, push through the death zone in the dark, reach the summit around midday, and begin the descent while enough daylight and oxygen remained to get down safely. The window was narrow, but achievable. Every calculation had been made. What the plan could not account for was the mountain. Above Camp 4, climbers encountered delays. Bottlenecks formed at technical sections. The balcony, the Hillary Step, where fixed ropes required climbers to wait, clipped in, burning oxygen and time while the line moved slowly upward. The delays were not catastrophic on their own, but on Everest, small things compound. Every extra minute at extreme altitude is a minute of deterioration. Every unnecessary oxygen breath on a fixed rope is a breath that will not be available on the descent. And every climber who looked up and saw the summit still close enough to reach made a calculation, conscious or not, that tipped toward going forward rather than turning back. By early afternoon, climbers who should have been descending were still ascending. The 2 o'clock rule began to blur into something softer, something negotiable. That pull is one of the most documented phenomena in high-altitude mountaineering. It even has a name, summit fever. The closer a climber gets, the harder the psychological force of turning around becomes. Add hypoxia, exhaustion, years of preparation, and the weight of the investment already made, and the decision to turn around becomes almost neurologically impossible for many people in that moment. And so, they kept climbing, one by one, past the turnaround time, into the afternoon. To understand what happens next, you need to understand what the death zone actually does to the human body. Not in the abstract, but in the specific mechanical way that it makes a climber dangerous to themselves. Above 8,000 meters, the air pressure is roughly a third of what it is at sea level. Every breath delivers approximately a third of the oxygen the body expects. The brain, one of the most oxygen-dependent organs in the body, begins to compensate almost immediately, and it is not good at it. Reaction time slows. Complex decision-making becomes harder. Short-term memory degrades. And because the brain itself is the instrument doing the assessment, the climber often cannot detect how impaired they are becoming. The body is failing in parallel. Muscles that have been working for 12 to 16 hours at altitude lose their fine coordination. The hands become unreliable. The legs begin to shake on technical terrain. Balance, which requires constant micro-adjustments from the inner ear and brain, working in coordination, becomes less precise. On a route where a single misclip, a single weight shift on an icy slope, or a single wrong step on exposed rock can mean a fall of thousands of feet. Less precise balance is not a minor inconvenience. It is a life-threatening deficit, and the cold compounds everything. Wind chill at high altitude can push effective temperatures to minus 40 degrees Celsius, making every physical task slower and every cognitive function worse. That is the trap of Everest. The cure for altitude illness is lower altitude, but the illness makes getting there harder. The summit is behind them. The light is going. Every step down the southeast ridge takes longer than the step before it. The fixed ropes that guided them up now require the same careful clipping in the opposite direction, with hands that are slower than they were this morning, and brains that have to consciously think about movements that should be automatic. The rock below the south summit is coated in thin ice. The wind is beginning to pick up. A bottle runs low. A guide calls out to a client who doesn't respond immediately. The temperature falls 15 degrees in minutes as the sun drops behind the ridge. Someone says they need 1 minute. Just 1 minute. And somewhere in that space, between the exhaustion and the darkness and the thinning oxygen, the chain that began forming hours ago, at a turnaround time that passed without being enforced, reaches the moment it was always building toward. For Scott Fisher, that chain included a summit at 3:40 in the afternoon and a body that had been at extreme altitude too long to complete the descent. For Hannelore Schmatz, it included a high bivouac with no shelter, overnight exposure, and the final moment when her legs could not carry her any further. For Subrata Ghosh, it included a refusal to move, whether from exhaustion, hypoxia, or something more complex, from a point below the Hillary Step that was still thousands of feet above safety. The mountain does not wait, it just keeps getting colder. After a death at extreme altitude, what happens next is often its own kind of tragedy. Hannelore Schmatz's body remained visible on the southeast ridge for years after her death in 1979, a landmark on one of Everest's most traveled routes. 2 Nepali police officers later died, attempting to recover her body from the mountain. The altitude that killed her made rescue impossible. This is a reality of Everest that is rarely discussed. At 8,000 meters and above, being alive is not the same as being savable. Rescue at those altitudes requires other climbers to expose themselves to the same conditions, the same oxygen depletion, the same deterioration, the same margins. That caused the death in the first place. Scott Fisher's death in 1996 sent shockwaves through the high-altitude mountaineering community. He was 40 years old, survived by a wife and 2 children. The 1996 disaster as a whole claimed 8 lives across 2 days, one of the single deadliest events in Everest's history to that point. Subrata Ghosh was 54 years old when he died below the Hillary Step in May 2025. His death occurred during what should have been the final hours of a successful summit bid. None of them wanted to die on Everest. All of them reached the top. The mountain collected the bill on the way down. When you lay the facts in sequence, a terrifying picture begins to form. These climbers were not killed by one clean, obvious mistake. They were killed by what safety researchers call the Swiss cheese model, a framework used in aviation, medicine, and high-risk environments to explain how catastrophic failures occur. The idea is that most systems have multiple layers of protection, each with their own weaknesses, like holes in Swiss cheese. Under normal circumstances, the holes never align. But when conditions deteriorate, when pressure builds, when small failures accumulate, the holes line up, and whatever should have been stopped passes straight through every layer at once. On Everest's descent, those layers fail in a specific order. The clock fails first. A late summit or unexpected delay narrows every margin that follows. The body fails second. Oxygen depletion, exhaustion, and cold begin their work on a system that has already been operating near its limit for hours. The plan fails third. The timing, the oxygen allocation, the team spacing, none of it matches the reality on the slope anymore. And the mind fails last. Summit fever, cognitive impairment from hypoxia, or simply the conviction that the hard part is over, leads to the final, fatal decision. That last failure is the hardest to account for in any plan, because the mind that fails is also the mind that is supposed to recognize the failure. At 8,000 meters, the instrument you use to detect danger is the same instrument the altitude is quietly dismantling. The research is clear, the pattern is documented, and it keeps happening. The summit is not success. It is permission to attempt the second half. Scott Fisher reached the top. Hannelore Schmatz reached the top. Subrata Ghosh reached the top. But Everest does not record survival at the summit. It records survival at the bottom.